All right. That's what I get for trying to charge my phone. But ready to go through some more about our diffusion of gases and thinking about gas exchange. Okay. So last week when we left off, we were talking about partial pressures, right? So in general, we got this idea that air is at some pressure, and that air contains a number of different types of gases, so a number of different molecules. We got nitrogen, we got oxygen primarily, but we'll also see that sometimes we have a lot of humidity, especially if we're thinking about air that has been sort of moisturized as it goes through your nasal passageways, your pharynx, down into your lungs. So we need to think of water vapor as a gas. We know that eventually we're going to be paying attention to carbon dioxide. So all partial pressures are we take a total pressure of the gas we're looking at, and then we take a percentage of that total number to give us a partial pressure. It's the responsibility of any one gas. So that's really all this is percentages, basically. So if you have more gases in your air, that's going to change what the partial pressure is for any one given gas. Okay. So our next piece of understanding partial pressures, and especially as we think about the way we use partial pressures when we talk in a clinical setting, we're often going to be talking about partial pressures of gases in blood. So we need to understand how these partial pressures in the air around you turn into a partial pressure in your bloodstream. So for that, we need to think about how soluble gases are in liquids. Okay. So when we say gases are soluble in liquids, right, you want to think of like a soda, right? It has carbon dioxide dissolved in it, right? So gas molecules can still exist in a liquid, just the way they can in a mixed gas in the air, okay? But the ability of any given gas to dissolve in a liquid is going to depend on what gas are we talking about and what liquid are we talking about. So when we're thinking about gases in the air, our vaporized gases, they'll have a partial pressure. Dissolved gases in a liquid will have a partial pressure. And as we're going to see, those will come to equilibrium if you have air touching a liquid. If they have enough time to kind of sit there, we'll find those partial pressures in our air and in our liquid coming to equilibrium. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean there's the same like concentration of a gas in the air as there is in the liquid though, okay? That's because of this solubility piece. Okay. So the solubility piece, if you were to calculate it out, you do it using this thing called Henry's law. And what we're looking at this for is to kind of understand this relationship between partial pressure and concentration, right? So in this case, K is a constant, so it's not something we'd look at specifically, right? C is a concentration of a gas dissolved in a liquid, and P is your partial pressure. And so in this case, we're thinking of the partial pressure of the gas in the atmosphere, so in the air, right? So we need to work with a constant to figure out, okay, how do we go from a partial pressure to an actual like chemical concentration, like how many moles are there dissolved in a liquid? But there is this direct relationship, right? They are proportional, right? So you can see that if the partial pressure of a gas in the atmosphere goes up, the concentration of a gas dissolved in a liquid would also go up, right? So they're moving in the same direction. Exact calculation just depends on a constant. Okay. Now that constant would tell you something about the solubility, okay? So primarily we're going to be thinking about oxygen and carbon dioxide when we track partial pressures in our blood, because what we care about is that oxygen that we're using to make ATP and that carbon dioxide that's our basically waste at the end of cellular respiration, okay? So we're going to take a look at the solubility of both of these gases. Okay. So if you were to calculate out both of these gases, what their concentration is in water, given a partial pressure of that gas in air of 100, right? So oxygen, partial pressure of 100 in air, carbon dioxide, partial pressure of 100 in air is what we're thinking about right now to understand the concept. You'd see that oxygen, when it comes to equilibrium with dissolved gases in water, oxygen in the water, you'd end up with 0.15 millimoles per liter of oxygen dissolving into the water. But you'll notice here, the carbon dioxide, we had a partial pressure of 100 in the air, right? We'd end up, when we come to equilibrium with that partial pressure in the water, so it matches that 100, you now have 3 millimoles per liter of carbon dioxide in the water, right? So we noticed last time that when we're looking at atmospheric air, the air you breathe, not a lot of it is carbon dioxide. When we did the calculations through, we didn't have a very high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our atmospheric air. It does end up getting a bit higher as you go through your respiratory tract and into the alveoli, especially because we know we have that kind of dead air sitting around in the lungs for a while, right? When we talked about that difference between minute ventilation and alveolar ventilation, we thought a little bit about that buildup of gases. But it's also important to realize that when we look at partial pressures of carbon dioxide in the blood, this carbon dioxide is more soluble in the blood than oxygen is. So this is going to change what our picture looks like pretty substantially to what we see when we're thinking about how much carbon dioxide is in the air. So different than when we're talking about the blood. Okay. So in picture form, because I like pictures, right? This is what we were basically saying in this previous slide. So we're looking first at the oxygen, right? So we're imagining our setup of a partial pressure of 100 for oxygen in our air. And our starting condition is no oxygen in the water, partial pressure of 0 at our starting point, right? Everything likes to come to equilibrium. It's one of the laws of the universe, so it happens, right? One of our laws of thermodynamics. So we can see that after we come to equilibrium, we've got a partial pressure of 100 still here in the air. You can see this is kind of an open container, right? But now we have a matching partial pressure of 100 for our oxygen in the water, but we can see that that's not actually that many oxygen molecules, right? We only have one dot down in here in the water to get us to that partial pressure of 100 for oxygen in the water, right? So we've got a pretty low concentration of oxygen in the water compared to if you gave the concentration of oxygen in the air. However, when we're thinking about diffusion of gases, right? And you want to compare like, okay, so I'm breathing this much oxygen and I want to know how that's affecting my bloodstream, right? It's helpful to be working with a number that's going to match between the air and the blood instead of trying to figure out from a concentration in the air, like, okay, how do I convert that to what the concentration would be in my blood, which is similar to what we'd see in water. So we're going to be using these partial pressure numbers for both the air and your bloodstream because of this piece where we have them coming to equilibrium and we have these partial pressures matching. So here's the case with carbon dioxide. So same setup, we started with a partial pressure of 100 in the air, nothing in the water. We wait for some time to pass. We come to equilibrium, so now our partial pressures match, right? But we can see that slightly higher solubility in this image of carbon dioxide, right? Now we've got 2 little dots here in the water, and we can see that higher concentration of carbon dioxide matching that same number in terms of partial pressure for carbon dioxide. So when we look at partial pressures of gases in blood, they're helpful because we can match them up to the air super easily, and they are indicative of like, is the concentration going up or down in the blood, but you don't want to think of them as direct measures of like the number of moles of carbon dioxide or oxygen in your blood. Okay, so similar but different. Okay. All right, so next we're going to be thinking about how oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged between the alveoli and the blood, right? So we're going to be thinking about what happens at the lungs. We're going to be thinking about what happens in the respiring tissue, so in the cells that are making ATP. And we're going to think a little bit about how do we see the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide changing in the alveoli, because this is really going to set us up for what numbers we're going to expect to see throughout our bodies in different arteries and veins. Okay. So like pretty much everything else we've talked about in this class, we're going to be looking at gradients and we're going to see stuff going from high to low, right? So in the case of diffusion of gases, we're going from a high partial pressure of that gas to a low partial pressure of that gas. That's the tendency we're going to see for these gas molecules to be moving. They're going to be diffusing down their pressure gradients. They're going to be moving down specifically their partial pressure gradients. So we do want to make sure that we recognize that we're looking at, right, a partial pressure of oxygen, right? The subscript matters. A partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that subscript matters, right? We can ignore the other partial pressures when we're tracking the action, the movement of a specific gas. Okay. So on the next page, or in your textbook that hopefully you glanced over before, we have a picture of something called the oxygen cascade, okay? And we're going to be going through the partial pressures of both oxygen and carbon dioxide in our alveoli in the lungs as they come to equilibrium with the capillaries in the lungs, go through your heart, move through systemic arteries, contact respiring tissues, and then come back through veins to the heart, okay? So I'm asking you this question so that we can kind of dial in on how to read this chart and what we want to notice as important about this figure that we're going to take a look at. Okay, so if you've got the figure in front of you, go ahead and read it. If you remember these numbers from the reading, go ahead and answer. I won't wait till everybody has answered, and then we'll kind of like talk through how we're looking at this figure. So first piece is figure out where can we find those partial pressures for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, we'll take a look at this one quick before I ask you another question, and I'll leave the figure up for a bit before we answer that next one. Okay. So these are our numbers that you're going to want to remember. So in our alveolar air, right, our partial pressure for oxygen is going to start out at 100, and our partial pressure for carbon dioxide is going to be at 40. Okay, so this is the figure we're kind of looking at. Okay, so what we're noticing here, right, is we have amounts given for our partial pressures in alveolar air. So this is where you would be reading those two numbers, right? We've got a number for oxygen. So in our alveoli, we have a partial pressure of 100 for oxygen and a partial pressure of 40 for carbon dioxide, right? And so this is the air we're going to see coming to equilibrium with the capillaries in our lungs, setting us up for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be moving through your bloodstream, as we move through the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we can see that these are nice, easy numbers to look at. If we were to give they're a bit different than we saw when we were calculating partial pressures in atmospheric air, right? So we had a really low partial pressure for carbon dioxide in atmospheric air. But as we've gone through the respiratory tract, we've added in water vapor, so that changes the partial pressures a bit. And as we get down into the alveoli, we mix with some old dead air, right? Also changing the partial pressures a bit. And that's how we get to these numbers. Okay, so next thing we want to focus in on in this chart, another thing that's going to be important, is to see how oxygen and carbon dioxide, their partial pressures change as we go through our different arteries and veins and pass our respiring tissue and come back. Okay, so we're going to focus in on oxygen first. Okay, so maybe we can see it, but I want you to take a look and notice, where do we see our first change, right? We're going to see that oxygen, let's focus on oxygen first, and we'll come back to the carbon dioxide. So we're starting at 100 with oxygen for our partial pressure in the alveoli. And we're going to see that when we return to the heart, right, it's not the same, right? So as we look at those veins, right, these pulmonary arteries, the ones that are going to the lungs, we got a partial pressure of oxygen is now only at 40, right? So where does this change happen? I'll take a second to look, and then we'll do the poll. All right, so where did we see that partial pressure of oxygen changing? Okay, let's read through it together. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we're gonna have a couple places, right? Okay. All right, so what we're noticing, right, in our alveolar air, right, so the air that's in those alveoli coming to equilibrium with the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, so pulmonary capillaries, capillaries of the lung, right? We've got a partial pressure of oxygen at 100, okay? So then that blood that's just been oxygenated travels through your cardiovascular system, okay? So first, we need to go back to the heart, right? So we actually are kind of in the middle of our heart cycle here, right? Our cardiac cycle as we pass by the lungs. So we're going to first go through a pulmonary vein and return to our left atrium, right? So here's that left atrium, right? So that the left side of our heart, our left ventricle here, can pump that freshly oxygenated blood out to your body, right? So we go out to the body through our systemic arteries, right? And nothing has changed about that partial pressure of oxygen yet, right? So we have 100 in the pulmonary veins coming back to the heart, in the systemic arteries, we're still at 100, okay? And it's when we get to the respiring tissue, to the cells, that we see our first change, right? So these cells that are making ATP, right, they're using up the oxygen. So those cells have a low partial pressure of oxygen because that oxygen got kind of used up. Okay. Now these dotted lines show that diffusion of the gases. So this is another point where we have partial pressures coming to equilibrium, where we have those gases moving down a high-low gradient of their specific partial pressure. Right? So as we pass by those systemic capillaries, this drops our partial pressure down to match the partial pressure of oxygen in those cells that are using oxygen. So now we're down at 40 from 100, right? So we go through the systemic veins with that value of 40 to the right side of the heart. So we got our right atrium, we got our right ventricle, then we have our pulmonary arteries sending blood to the lungs. Oxygen is at 40 all throughout, right? And then the second change would be as we loop around. So as we loop around, we come to equilibrium again. So we return to that partial pressure of 100 at the lungs. Okay. So these are numbers that you're going to want to know, right? So you're going to want to know that our two options for partial pressures for oxygen, really, that we're going to be paying attention to, right, is we've got places where that partial pressure of oxygen is 100. Okay. So that's in our alveoli, in these pulmonary capillaries, in the pulmonary veins, in the systemic arteries. And then we're going to have times where our partial pressure of oxygen is at 40. Right, so as we're returning to the heart, we're at 40. As we're going through the right side of the heart, you'd be at 40. As you're going out to the lungs in those pulmonary arteries, you'd be at 40 until you come back to equilibrium with the alveolar air, going back to 100. Okay. We can trace the same flow with carbon dioxide, right? And we see shifts at the same places, right? So we're going to be starting out with a partial pressure of carbon dioxide at 40, right? So this is going to be our lower number for carbon dioxide, right? So we're going to want to know our two numbers to know for carbon dioxide. We got a partial pressure of 40. And the other number we'll pay attention to on the opposite side is 46, right? Okay. So those are two options if I ask you for a partial pressure for carbon dioxide, right? So we just have to match them up to where we'd see these, right? So we're going to start with the lower number as we're going through pulmonary veins, left side of the heart, and those systemic arteries, right? Because this is blood that hasn't picked up carbon dioxide yet, because carbon dioxide is a waste product. So it's as we pass these cells that are doing stuff, our respiring tissue, more formally, right, that we see this higher level of carbon dioxide because we've produced carbon dioxide as a byproduct of metabolism. So that carbon dioxide comes to equilibrium with the carbon dioxide in your bloodstream, right? So that is how we're picking up some excess carbon dioxide and returning it to your lungs so that you can breathe it out. Okay. So you do want to pay attention to those numbers, and they'll appear again, okay? So this diffusion between the alveoli and the blood is quite rapid. We talked about the barrier for this diffusion already, right? So all we have to pass through are those type 1 alveolar cells, that basement membrane sandwiching those type 1 alveolar cells to our capillary endothelial cells, right? Small barrier to diffusion, but lots of surface area. We know we have a lot of surface area of all those alveoli in the lungs. So this happens pretty quickly. All right, so how quickly exactly? We're looking at the length here of a pulmonary capillary. All right, so length of 100%, these are in percentages. Right? And here we're looking at what's going on with our partial pressure of oxygen as you move through the length of a capillary. All right, so here's the first place we see those numbers for partial pressure of oxygen again. Right? Our two numbers we're paying attention to are 140. Right? So when we come to the beginning of our pulmonary capillary, we're at 40. That's our low value for oxygen. Right? We don't have much oxygen in the blood yet. By the time we get about a third of the way through that pulmonary capillary, we're already at our new higher value for oxygen for its partial pressure. So we come to equilibrium with the alveolar air quite quickly, about a third of the way through, which means we have like a lot of buffer room in the capillaries, right? So if you're using a lot of extra oxygen, your breathing changes, right? You have room to still exchange oxygen sufficiently through those pulmonary capillaries, right? So if it took you a little longer to come to equilibrium, wouldn't be a problem. We've got extra space here. Okay. Same thing is happening if we look at the partial pressure for CO2, right? The curve is going the other way, right? Because venous blood, the blood in those systemic veins coming back to the heart, and therefore also in the pulmonary arteries going to the lungs. Mixed venous blood has this higher pressure of carbon dioxide of 46. By the time we get about a third of the way through this capillary, we've gotten rid of some of that excess carbon dioxide, and we've dropped down to a partial pressure of 40 for the rest of the capillary. Okay. If we like this in bullet point form, here we've got it again, right? So our gases are diffusing down their partial pressure gradients. So here for your notes, we've got listed out, right, that partial pressure of oxygen in your respiring tissue in those cells, right, of 40 or potentially less, right? So as we see this diffusion down our partial pressure gradient, right, the artery coming towards the cell was at a partial pressure of 100. That partial pressure of 40 in the cell actually making ATP is lower, right? So we have this high-low gradient, right? So higher partial pressure in the artery, lower in that active cell. All right, so we see that movement of oxygen into our respiring tissue until we come to equilibrium. All right, so we have the oxygen going from the blood into these cells until these numbers match, and then that oxygen returns to the heart with this lower partial pressure. Okay. Carbon dioxide, we're just kind of flipping arrows here, right? The carbon dioxide of tissue that's active is at a partial pressure of about 46, right? So this is pretty high relative to the blood that we're sending to that tissue, right? So in our arteries going to the tissue, we're at 40, right? So now we see our gas move the opposite direction when we're tracking carbon dioxide compared to oxygen. So we're still just going down our partial pressure gradient though, right? So high to low. So this is how we have carbon dioxide moving from the cells that are producing it into the bloodstream until we come to equilibrium and then send that blood back to the heart to match that partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the cells here. So these are the numbers that you want to remember. 100, we've got 40 in two places, right? 40 for oxygen and 40 for carbon dioxide. And then our higher number for carbon dioxide is 46. Okay. So the chart looks like a lot. The figure of all the blood and partial pressures moving around has a lot of numbers on it, but most of them are the same numbers. Okay. Right. So we're thinking about that mixed venous blood and why we see these partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide in them. Right? So we could see some differences from these kind of textbook values, right? We know that different tissue is going to be more or less metabolically active at different times, right? If you're using a muscle, it's going to be using more ATP and generating more ATP than if you're not. Right, so that's why we're paying attention to the mixed venous blood. That's why it's labeled like that. It's because we want to have a nice, easy number to look at in general for the whole body. But we would see that when we have different numbers in a section of tissue, right? Say you're using more oxygen, so that oxygen level in the cells is lower, you'd end up seeing greater exchange between the blood and the tissue at that point, right? Because you have a bigger gradient, basically. But it works conceptually the same way. We're just coming to equilibrium with whatever we're passing. And ideally, we're just replacing all the oxygen that you used and removing all the excess carbon dioxide that you produced, okay? So in any given like named vein, you might see slightly different numbers, but by the time you get back to the right atrium and the right ventricle and then head out to the lungs and the pulmonary arteries, these are the values we'd expect to see. Okay. So when we think about why we have those partial pressures in the alveolar air, so in the individual alveoli, right? So partial pressure of 100 for oxygen, partial pressure of 40 for carbon dioxide are our numbers to compare to. We'd be thinking about how much ventilation do we have of those alveoli? So here we're thinking about things like our minute ventilation and our alveolar ventilation, right? So minute ventilation being just how much fresh air did you breathe in a minute? Alveolar ventilation being, okay, how much fresh air did you breathe in per minute? But also let's account for the fact that there's some dead air in there because not the entire lung is part of our respiratory zone. We've also got some conducting zone stuff in there. And we also have alveoli occupied by old air, right? So we got mixing together, right? Plus, we'd see some potential changes based on your activity levels, right? So how much oxygen are you using right now? How much carbon dioxide are you producing, right? And those are kind of the things that might affect those partial pressures, right? So if you see changes, right, it could be because, say, your respiration rate changes, right? So how many breaths you take per minute changes. That might change your minute ventilation. It might change your alveolar ventilation for sure, right? So you might start to see changes to those partial pressures in that case. Or if you're using lots and lots of oxygen and producing lots and lots of carbon dioxide, if you don't keep up with that by changing your alveolar ventilation, you might also see partial pressures changing. So these are some words you would want to know related to those differences that you might see in these partial pressures, okay? So usually your ventilation, so your breathing, should be changing to meet demand, right? We looked at on like the first slide last week of this section, right, that hopefully we've got the amount of oxygen we're using at our tissue being replaced by the amount of oxygen you're breathing in. And the same thing for carbon dioxide. We want the amount of carbon dioxide you're producing to be matched by the amount of carbon dioxide you're breathing out, okay? So if you are working extra hard, using extra oxygen, producing extra carbon dioxide, it's actually normal and good that you breathe a little faster, right? So the word for this is hyperpnea, right? So hyperpnea is okay. It's a sign that you're working hard, but this is an increase in ventilation because you have an increased demand for oxygen and an increased need to get rid of carbon dioxide, right? So someone breathing fast when they're exercising, that's great, right? You want that oxygen. Okay. And when we use the words hypoventilation and hyperventilation, this means that we have air movement that isn't matching up to the rate at which you're using oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. All right, so in the case of hypoventilation, so hypo being low, right, this means you're breathing too slowly, you're breathing too little to get all that oxygen replenished, right? And to remove all that carbon dioxide. So you're going to see oxygen levels in those arteries heading to the tissue. They're going down, right? Because you're not breathing often enough. You're not getting enough air per minute into those alveoli, right? So we're not fully replacing that used oxygen. So if you're hypoventilating, you're going to see lower partial pressures of oxygen in the arteries. And you're going to see higher partial pressures of carbon dioxide in those same arteries because you weren't breathing enough to get rid of all that carbon dioxide. Hyperventilation is the opposite, right? Say you're having a panic attack, you're breathing too fast, right? And you're not breathing too fast because you're exercising hard. You're breathing too fast for other reasons, right? So in this case, we've got ventilation, so air movement, that exceeds the demands you actually have for these gases. So in this case, we're going to see a buildup of oxygen, right? Because you're breathing extra, you're pulling in more oxygen per minute. And you're going to see that you're blowing off excess carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide level is going down, right? So you keep breathing it out, even though you weren't producing that much. So in these cases, we would see changes to the partial pressures of these gases in your blood if we haven't matched up our breathing to how we're actually using the gases. Okay. There are lots more words that relate to breathing when we talk about respiratory physiology more generally, words that you might see in a medical context, right? So lots of them have this word, this ending pnea in the end, right? So that's a indicator to you that we're talking about something to do with breathing, right? And we got the word ventilation a bunch, right? So we know ventilation is that movement of air, right? And we're paying attention that we know hyperventilation and hypoventilation specifically, right? And you can see some other words specify, okay, what are our levels of oxygen? Emia is a blood ending. What are our levels of oxygen in the blood specifically? Or we might be looking at carbon dioxide levels. Capnia is going to usually indicate that we're talking about carbon dioxide levels. So I don't expect you to know all these terms. We're just looking at those three that we defined on the previous slide. All right, but these are probably words that you're going to want to be familiar with sometime later on in your lives. Okay. So we're going to head into transport of the gases next. All right, so now that we've traced the gases in the air and how they're coming to equilibrium in the blood, we're going to be thinking about specifically how they're doing that. So we're going to be looking back at our old friend hemoglobin now. Okay. So when we're thinking about transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, right, we're going to be thinking largely about hemoglobin, right? Because this is where we see most of our oxygen, right? So we saw when we were looking at that solubility of gases in blood, oxygen doesn't dissolve in water very well. It doesn't dissolve in blood very well. So in the plasma, you're only going to see about 1.5% of the oxygen just dissolved, spread out in the liquid itself. Right? This is why hemoglobin is important, right? You want more oxygen moving around your body than that, like more oxygen than you could just put in the liquid on its own, right? So we have to bind that oxygen onto hemoglobin to up our kind of carrying capacity of blood for oxygen. Okay. So when we look at this, right, hemoglobin is going to be denoted by HB, right? So that's going to be hemoglobin, right? And we're going to see hemoglobin binding to oxygen, okay? And when we see this HB.O2, right, that's how we denote that these two things are bound together. We also have like written English words we can use for these compounds, right? So hemoglobin on its own is deoxyhemoglobin. So deoxy, no oxygen, hemoglobin. And hemoglobin bound to oxygen, straightforward, oxyhemoglobin, two things are bound together. Okay. So what we're actually looking at when we look at this diffusion of oxygen in the lungs, right? We see these partial pressures of oxygen coming to equilibrium between the alveoli and our bloodstream, right? At this partial pressure of 100. But we're going to see that most of that oxygen, right, is going to try to jump into a red blood cell where we see hemoglobin and bind onto that hemoglobin. So when we get to our tissue, right, to get rid of the oxygen, we're going to need that oxygen to jump off of our hemoglobin, out of our red blood cell, and get into the tissue. Okay. So when we look at a hemoglobin molecule, we know it's got 4 subunits. So it's got 4 parts. It's got 4 heme groups because there's one in each of those subunits. So combined, 4 oxygen molecules, right? We got like 4 spots for oxygen. Okay. And we will not be drawing this squiggly little Pokemon-looking figure every time we talk about hemoglobin. Since we've got 4 spots for oxygen, you're going to see in your slides, right? We're just going to have a box with 4 spots here, right? So each of these is going to be able to take on 1 oxygen molecule. And so when we see this, we're indicating for each of these subunits, do we have an oxygen bound to the heme group there or not? Okay. So binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin, like a lot of things, follows the law of mass action. Right? So if you don't remember the law of mass action, right, really what we're talking about there is often when we're thinking about reversible reactions, right, we're going to say that if we have whatever, reactants A turning into products B, if you've got lots of the reactants, right, the equation is generally going to run this way towards this lower thing, lots to less, so high to low again, really. If we happen to have high amounts of B, this would push the reaction to run more in the opposite direction a little bit, right? So high, low, the other way, right? So that's all we mean by the law of mass action here. So when we have more oxygen, right, we're going to end up binding more of that oxygen to hemoglobin. Okay. So we're going to see that our hemoglobin isn't always completely full of oxygen. We don't always have all 4 of those heme groups occupied. So we're going to be thinking about the saturation of hemoglobin, right? We're going to be thinking about how much oxygen do we actually have per hemoglobin molecule here. Okay. So if we have all 4 spots occupied, it'll be 100%. We're drawing those little boxes, right? We split it in quarters, basically. So you might have 100%, you might have 75, 50, 25, or none if you were just looking at 1 hemoglobin molecule. Okay. So that's what these little boxes here are. They're showing you the hemoglobin, and each of those little blue-purple dots is one of our oxygen molecules. Okay. So we can see here conceptually, right? We're looking at our arterial blood. Right, we're looking at that partial pressure of 100, okay? And we're looking at the situation now, right? So a little bit of that oxygen is just directly dissolved in the blood. So that's that 1.5%, right? But we can see that most of that oxygen is in our hemoglobin, right? So if we were to completely saturate our hemoglobin, so 4 oxygen molecules in every little molecule of hemoglobin, you'd end up seeing hemoglobin molecules carrying about 1.34 milliliters of oxygen. Okay. Now, a normal blood hemoglobin level, I think you probably calculated out in physiology lab in A&P 1. So this is just a reminder. Our normal levels are going to be about 2 to 17 grams per deciliter. Or we can think of it as 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood, right? And of these numbers that we're going to potentially remember, like if you were to remember one, probably this one. Okay. But in terms of our amounts, we just kind of want to be thinking up and down for right now. We do want to know that we're not really at 100% saturated usually in the arteries. We're close, right? But we got a little extra space here. So the hemoglobin is usually 98.5% saturated, right? Because it's not like oxygen is going to come into contact with absolutely every single hemoglobin molecule in your body, right? When we return in the venous blood, right, when we have this partial pressure of 40, as we're coming back to the heart, and even as we go through the right side of the heart and out to the lungs, right, we're going to notice that we have a lower saturation of hemoglobin, right? But it's not actually as low as you might expect, right? So when we're returning in the veins to the heart, usually we're going to see that hemoglobin still 75% saturated. So like 3 out of those 4 spots on the hemoglobin molecule are still going to be filled. So usually in normal conditions, as you're moving from our deoxygenated blood to oxygenated blood, we're really just filling in and emptying this last slot on our hemoglobin molecule. We can think about this a little more precisely by looking at this hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, so we're going to look at this right now, but we're going to spend more time thinking about this later in the week as well. Then we're going to focus right now on how we read one, right? Okay, so what we're looking at partial pressures of oxygen, right? And we're looking at the full range of partial pressures you could see, right? So 0 to, usually we're going to be looking at 100 because that's one of our important numbers, right? So partial pressure of 100 is important because that's the partial pressure you see in arteries, the systemic arteries specifically. 40 is another point that we're going to pay close attention to because that's the partial pressure that we see for oxygen in our systemic veins, right? But there does exist a relationship between how saturated you would expect hemoglobin to be at any given partial pressure, right? So that's our oxygen saturation here, right? So what percent of those hemoglobin slots are filled, right? So we can see if we are right at the beginning trying to load our very first oxygens onto hemoglobin, you have empty hemoglobin and you need to put some oxygen into it, that starts out kind of slow, right? But once we have a little bit of oxygen in there, this actually creates this effect where it's easier to add more oxygen once you've already started saturating your hemoglobin molecules. So we see a big spike. And here we could read that value that we just gave for our systemic veins of about 75%, right? Matching up to the partial pressure that we see in those veins. And then we start to see a plateau as we try to fully fill those hemoglobin. We don't get all the way there, but we're at 98.5% by the time we're at this partial pressure of 100 in the systemic arteries. Okay, so next time we're going to be talking about what can shift this line to the right and left and what it means for you and your body and your tissues if we do see that.